The crack tore the night wide open in San Francisco Canyon. It sounded like rock splitting under a hammer the size of a mountain, a deep, grinding report that rolled just before midnight on March 12, 1928. Then the ground shuddered, and a low thunder gathered without end. Moments later, a black wall of water rushed out of the gorge where the St. Francis Dam had stood. Houses blinked awake to a roar that swallowed their own windows. Chickens exploded from coops. Dogs howled. People reached for doorknobs and found water there first. The reservoir had let go. The first wave carried concrete and trees as easily as straw and came on so fast that the dark itself seemed to lift and move. The dam had been completed in 1926, 2 years of cement and confidence stacked in an arc more than 200 feet high. It was the work of William Mulholland, the engineer who had driven the Los Angeles aqueduct across desert and mountain. St. Francis was a storage basin tucked in a canyon north of the city, a quiet piece of a machine that kept faucets running. Its failure arrived without a storm and without an earthquake. At 11:57 p.m., the structure parted and the reservoir became motion. More than 12 billion gallons surged into San Francisco Canyon in the time it takes a person to sit up in bed. In the first minutes, the flood leapt down the canyon at something like 18 miles an hour. The wave ran well over 100 feet high at the start, frothing with torn trees and pulverized concrete, and it hit the workers' camp directly below like a fist. Cottages splintered, a bunkhouse rolled, a car spun in the water like a bottle cap. Some woke and ran barefoot into the yard and never reached the fence. Those who reached a fence found the fence moving too. A man who tried to lift a door found the door had no frame anymore. A telephone operator stayed at her switchboard until the lines went dead, calling downstream towns by name between breaths. The wave widened and carried the canyon's contents with it. It sheared hillsides and chewed roads. It ripped orange trees out by the rows and folded them into rafts. When the flood reached the first ranches, it carried more than water, lumber, fence posts, furniture, livestock, and the people who had owned them a minute earlier. Telephone poles went slack and snapped, spitting blue light before they died. With them went the last chance to warn the valley. Deputies fired pistols into the air to wake sleeping neighborhoods and waved people toward higher ground. Families hauled children onto trucks that nearly stalled in rising water. Others climbed trees and watched roofs crack beneath them. Farther west, the Santa Clara River gathered the flood and delivered it to town after town. In Fillmore and Bardsdale, people woke to a sound like a freight train and a wall of black that erased the street in front of their porch. In Santa Paula, parish bells rang where anyone could reach a rope, not for service, but alarm. Men ran with lanterns and ropes. Women threw coats over nightgowns and grabbed babies. The water came filled with splinters, barbed wire, fuel, and silt. It sandblasted faces and packed noses with mud. Survivors later described the taste as dirt and metal together. One woman rode a mattress for more than a mile, her grip so tight that skin peeled when she let go. A farmhand surfaced under the rail of a bridge and chose to break his shoulder to slip through and live. By dawn, the flood had traveled nearly 54 miles to the Pacific. It left behind a corridor that looked bulldozed by a giant who did not care about lines. The official death toll settled at 431. Modern reviews lift that number to between 450 and 600 because migrant camps along the river were erased so completely the county could not count who had been there. Days later, bodies washed ashore at the river mouth and down the coast. Others were never found, buried under new banks that looked like they had always been there. Searchers moved for weeks through ragged piles of lumber and wire, calling names that had no answer. Back in the canyon, the dam stood in broken profile. A tall central wedge clung to the slope like a tooth snapped off at the gum, and below it lay chunks of concrete the size of railroad cars. The fracture faces showed fresh aggregate and long planes where the structure had slid. Mulholland arrived before sunup. The day before, he had inspected the dam after reports of seepage and declared it safe. At the coroner's inquest, he took the blame without qualifiers. If there was an error of human judgment, he said, he was the human. His career ended there, his reputation tied forever to the failure. Investigators followed the damage into the ground. The abutments had been keyed into ancient, water-weakened rock that slaked when wet and lost strength under load. The right abutment slid, the left rotated, the arch lost its seat. During construction, the crest had been raised without thickening the base in proportion. There was no single villainous flaw, only decisions and geology that added up to collapse. The verdict, foundation failure, became a case study that still anchors lessons on dam design, uplift, and site investigation. The human record kept the story awake when the reports went cold. A nurse in Santa Paula remembered washing mud from survivors' mouths by the bucket. A rancher found his front steps a mile from where his house had been, and nothing else from his life within sight. A school teacher counted 27 students present the week before and 19 after. A telephone man, pulled half-conscious from a cottonwood, could not explain how he had traveled 2 miles clinging to a fence post he didn't remember grabbing. These fragments populated the silence the flood left behind. The canyon itself holds memory the way a scar does. Hikers still find blocks of dam concrete down the drainage, edges rounded by heat and flood, faces stamped with board marks from forms. At night, sound bounces off rock in a way that makes a single footstep carry. Locals talk about voices on the wind and a cold that moves through the notch even on warm evenings. You don't need ghost stories to feel unsettled. The scale of the loss is in the ground. A person standing on the old road can see where the reservoir lay and where the wave first broke free. The collapse ended a certain era of swagger in Los Angeles. The city still grew, still needed water, but oversight hardened. Geologists gained authority. New dams were built with different assumptions about rock, drainage, and failure modes. The state created stronger review boards. St. Francis joined Johnstown and Austin as names engineers speak with a low voice. In lecture halls, photos of the broken abutment share the screen with cross-sections that explain how it let go. Nothing neat closes the story. The river rebuilt its banks. Families rebuilt houses on higher ground. Trails thread the canyon where the reservoir once lay. The ruins remain, and the count remains uncertain. What is certain is the shape of that night, a crack, a release, a wave that moved through sleeping rooms, a line of lanterns after, men wading mud to their knees, women washing grit from children's hair that wouldn't come out for days. The disaster was not an act of mystery. It was load on weak rock and the speed with which consequences travel in the dark. If you stand there at dusk and listen, the canyon carries a hush that sounds like water even when the stream runs thin. Somewhere down the slope sit the broken teeth of a dam that tried to hold more than the ground would allow. The lesson is still there in concrete and soil and in the names that did not make it to morning. The story endures because the place does, and because every spring the river reminds the valley what it can do when it is given the chance. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.